So our next speaker for today is Dr. Lindsay M. Jaacks. She is a global expert in health, nutrition and sustainable food systems. She holds the personal chair of global health and nutrition at the University of Edinburgh and has previously been an assistant professor at Harvard University. And her research explores the intersection of agriculture, nutrition and health, with a strong focus on the effects of pesticides and health benefits of sustainable farming. So she will be presenting on the why food systems transformation is critical in the wake of food safety and nutrition crisis. So we welcome you, ma'am. Kindly take over.
And I don't think I'm quite worthy of the honor of sitting on this panel with the esteemed speakers who are here tonight, but it really it's great to be here. And I know very little about agriculture. I've learned much of what I know from Dr. Ramu over the years, and my background is in nutrition. So what I'm really interested in is trying to understand how our food production systems and what we grow influences health and nutrition outcomes in people. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So first slide. And I am a lecturer at the university, so I rely on my slides. Apologies for that. So why is a person who is working in nutrition and public health talking and interested about agriculture and agroecology in particular? Of course, the link between agriculture and these outcomes is food and what we eat. And the focus over the past 100 years has very much been on the nutritive component of food, so that are in foods that we consume. And particularly thinking about pesticide residues in food and how those might also contribute to these same outcomes. So just expanding sort of the chemicals within food that we are looking at. In terms of nutrition outcomes in India, this will not be a surprise to people. Of course, the NFHS, the National Family Health Survey, came out with the 5th round just 2 years, a little over 1 year back actually. And these data showed some interesting trends actually. And I'll just flag that NFHS 6 has completed data collection, but the results are not out yet. So this data collection spans the COVID years. But what you can see in this slide is just what percent of adult women on the left and men on the right, have different forms of malnutrition. And when I say malnutrition, I tend to refer to not just undernutrition, but also things like obesity and nutrition-related diseases like diabetes. Particularly in adults, is actually going down, so the green arrow indicates it's going down compared to previous NFHS rounds, but it's also much lower than abdominal obesity, so a high hip-to-waist ratio. And the other thing you can see is that diabetes itself is actually rising in India, and this is true not just in urban areas, but also in rural areas. So take a place like Andhra Pradesh, where a lot of our work is, about 1 in 5 adult men has diabetes in rural areas, not just in urban areas. The other thing to point out here is anemia. I'm sure people have read the news that when NFHS 5 came out, that anemia rates had actually increased compared to the previous year, or the previous round of NFHS. And that was true both sides. But interestingly, the prevalence of anemia in men is almost 1 in 3. And that's interesting because of the underlying biology. You would expect women to have a very high rate of anemia. Even in the UK, where I run a national diet survey, we see that in adolescent girls in the UK, upwards of 40% are experiencing anemia. So this is it's a biological process that happens to some extent with menstruation, which is a big predictor of anemia. And so I think it's interesting in the Indian context, this almost 1/3 of men, because it does suggest that there's some underlying contributor, and I'll talk a little bit about diet diversity, that may be contributing to anemia and these micronutrient deficiencies in both women who have this underlying biology as well as men. In terms of next slide, which shows the same NFHS5 data for children under 5 years, the picture's a little bit different with kids, where undernutrition is much more prevalent, but we are seeing a big increase in overweight. Universally around the world, kids have a lower prevalence of overweight and obesity compared to adults, but we see this really big uptick. So something's happening between when they're under 5 and when they hit the age of 15, particularly in those adolescent years where we're seeing this increase in overweight and obesity. So there's lots to explore in that space. But again, anemia pops up as being really prevalent in the sample. So what could be contributing to these national trends that we see in nutrition? Diets, of course, is the main thing that we've been looking at. And earlier this year, Dr. Kapoor up at ISI, the Indian Institute, Statistical Institute up in Delhi, and his team published a really great report that summarized the latest NSSO data on household expenditures on food. And they compared, though the methodology changed between 2011 and the 2023 survey, they did a really good, excellent job of comparing those two surveys to look at trends in food consumption over time. This survey is household level, so one limitation of that survey is we don't know distribution within the household. So we don't know what women ate in the household, what kids ate, what the adult men ate. We just know what the household consumed. But what was interesting is for the first time ever, well, I guess ever since they've been monitoring expenditures over the past 70 years or so in terms of food expenditure, less than 50% of household income on average is gold. Of course, this suggests that PDS is having the desired effect in terms of loosening up household budgets, reducing expenditure on cereals, and allowing households that additional income to spend on more nutrient-dense foods, so things like fresh fruits and potentially animal source foods. And in fact, that's exactly what the data show. So this increased expenditure on dairy products, eggs, fish and meat, these animal source products, as well as fresh fruits. The biggest increase actually was in fresh fruits. But worryingly, there was also this increased expenditure on packaged processed foods. And that goes back to those trends that I showed with rising overweight, obesity, and diabetes. One final thing to mention about this report, if you haven't read it yet, there's an interesting section where they look at seasonality. And what they find is actually compared to 10 years ago, recent data suggests that there's less fluctuation in household expenditure, meaning that there's less seasonality in food consumption. And that was true for all the food groups analyzed, including fruits. Suggesting that there's potentially a more reliable supply of these products throughout the year. The findings of the NSSO report are really similar to an evaluation that we've just finished up that was published today, actually, so funny enough, the timing. And I've included the link here, and my slides can be shared online so people can click this. But in this evaluation in UP, we looked at a farmer-producer organization, and we were really interested in understanding not just the impact of membership in FPOs on income, which has been explored previously, but the outcomes like diet diversity, and we actually also looked at women's empowerment, but I've not shown that here. And the reason we did that is we thought that being an FPO member, you might see, for example, increases in crop diversification or increases in income, which would then lead to an increase in diet diversity. So we were interested in testing out these pathways. And on the next slide, I show the impacts of that. So basically what we found was that if you were the farmers who were members of the FPO, they had increased diet diversity. That diet diversity was driven, however, by increases in both healthy foods, so that all of these nutrient-rich foods increase, whether it be different types of vegetables, fresh fruits, some of the animal source foods like curd and fish. But also they had an increase in unhealthy foods. So again, you see that as diets transition, as household income goes up, you're not just buying the healthy foods, but also the unhealthy foods. And I think that this is, when we think about food systems and production systems, this is something that we have to keep in mind, because really the leading cause of death in India right now is cardiovascular disease. And so we need to try and think about what sorts of interventions can we do that promote the healthy foods and discourage the unhealthy foods. So when thinking about that, I thought it was worthwhile to just mention this really helpful tool that I teach in my classes back in the UK. And this is sort of an intervention ladder. And so it basically summarizes what types of interventions from a public health standpoint can you implement in order to impact people's behaviors. And I think it was originally developed actually for tobacco, but we use it a lot when thinking about unhealthy foods. And at the very bottom of the ladder is doing nothing. And at the very top is the strongest thing you could do, which is eliminate choice. So if you take the example of tobacco, that would be banning tobacco or banning smoking, for example, making it illegal. So it's obviously a very extreme intervention, but in between these, it kind of ranks the different types of interventions that can be done, whether that's taxing things or reducing the cost of healthy things. But what I wanted to point out is just one step up from doing nothing is educating people. I think that there is some risk when I talk to people about how do we address this increase in, it suggests that is not effective. There's lots of evidence that people know what a healthy fruits and vegetables every day. Most people probably don't hit that. Actually, in this room, probably a lot of people do, but usually the population level, they're not. So, so just to say that I think that we need to think about where unhealthy foods like this are advertised as being healthy to kids, and they really confuse parents. And so I think that trying to think about potentially marketing regulations, regulating how you market products. So for example, should you be able to market a sugary beverage like chocolate milk as being a growth promoting, nutrient-rich food when it's really high in sugar and really wouldn't be advised for kids. So just moving up that ladder. So the rest of my presentation just focuses on the other exposures in food, moving beyond the nutrient component to think about pesticide exposure, which was mentioned is a big focus of my own work. So next slide. I'm not going to go through all the evidence on health effects of pesticides that we've been working on and others globally. But just summarizing some of the things that I think have the most conclusive evidence to date in terms of links between pesticide exposure and health outcomes. And there are really two different biological pathways that most pesticide classes act through. So the first one on the first bullet here is as an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. So acetylcholine is the most common neurotransmitter in our bodies, and a major class of pesticides such as organophosphates, which are widely used, they prevent the breakdown of that neurotransmitter in our bodies. So it accumulates within our brains and our nerve cells. This can, of course, have an impact on child development, their brain development, and that's something that we're looking at in Andhra Pradesh is potentially, as farmers transition to natural farming, are there benefits in terms of children's development in those households? But it can also affect neurological function in older age. So there's a very large study of farmers called the Agriculture Cohort Study in the US, which has been following pesticide sprayers for decades now. And one of the clear signals in that cohort is that these sprayers are at increased risk of Parkinson's disease. The other pathway that's well established is this endocrine disruption pathway. And this is the pathway that leads to things like diabetes, but also cancer outcomes, as well as reproductive functions, particularly on male fertility. Next slide. I just wanted to highlight, because I don't know if this is in the news in India, but in the US, which is where I'm originally from, these lawsuits against Monsanto, which is now owned by Bayer, are a huge deal. It was just actually, Bayer was just at Congress talking about this 2 weeks back. So basically what's going on in the US right now is there's a chemical called glyphosate, which is an herbicide, and Monsanto makes it still, which is owned by Bayer. And there have been over 100,000 lawsuits filed against them, and they've already paid out $11 billion to these plaintiffs. And I know I'm over on time. I'll finish this in 1 second. But I just wanted to say that it's interesting. The reason this is interesting is that they are now saying, because of these lawsuits, they're threatening to pull glyphosate from the US market, which is the biggest market. And I don't know what this means for India, but if they pull it from the US market, I would be slightly worried about it, because I know herbicide use is already coming up here. So it's something maybe to just keep an eye on. But it is actually really unprecedented that this litigation could potentially result in the banning of one of the most widely used pesticides in the US. Final bit really actually is that in addition to looking at how consuming exposure to pesticides leads to adverse outcomes, you can also look at how consuming organic foods protects you or improves your health outcomes. So this is one of the most famous studies that's looked at that. It's a French study that's looked at over 30,000 participants over more than a decade now. And they have found a significant reduced risk of diabetes with increased consumption of organic food. And just to put this in perspective, the effect of consuming organic food in this study is comparable in effect size to the effect of consuming sugary drinks. So everyone knows that sugary drinks, of course, increase risk of diabetes. This study is showing that organic food consumption can protect you to the same extent that increases your risk. I could probably explain that better, but I'm happy to clarify later. So next slide. I'll skip over these details. Again, I'll share these slides, but just to say that there have been studies that show, to just kind of complete that pathway, that consuming organic food significantly reduces your exposure to pesticides as measured in your urine within 2 days of consuming an all-organic diet. So these effects can be realized almost immediately. So it's a very acute response. So we can skip over these. These just show that evidence of reduced exposure. So we're doing this large randomized controlled trial in Andhra Pradesh that's looking at the health effects of transitioning to natural farming. We've just finished the end-line data collection last month. I'm looking at our project manager and our field supervisors in the back. We've just finished the end-line data collection, so the final results we're expecting sometime this summer. But I have some preliminary results that I wanted to just close with on the next slide, I think. Yes, here. We have, in a pilot, we looked at urinary pesticide exposure in APCNF, Andhra Pradesh Community Managed Natural Farming farmers, as well as chemical farmers. And what we found was that even in this sample where they're not exclusive natural farmers, so they're still practicing a mix. On some of their land, they're naturally farming, on others, they're chemical farming. Even with that mix, we found significantly lower levels in 2 of the 3 biomarkers that we looked at. And I think this is quite remarkable because the difference was quite substantial, and this is a small sample, so it suggests a very strong signal coming from this pesticide pilot that we did. The third one didn't significantly reduce, and this could be the mix of practices, or it could be the fact that these farmers are not consuming only the food that they're growing. They're also, of course, getting PDS, rice, they're getting food from markets, so there could be some other routes of exposure, not just through farming. Okay, so I think I'll just close there. I think this is just about our diet, but the next one I think is just, yeah, this is kind of my concluding slide. I just added this actually right before I came, because we are very much focused on pesticide exposure, but we've just recently started thinking about monitoring heat exposure in farmers, getting back to what was said about climate change. Farmers are not just exposed to pesticides. There's so many occupational exposures that need to be explored when thinking about the health of farmers. So looking forward to questions and discussion about kind of broadening the work that we're doing, thinking about laborers and their well-being. So anyway, sorry I've run a little bit over, but thank you again, and looking forward to questions, and we'll stick around as well for discussion.